6:30, and those who thought the lecture was starting at 6:30 will be here. It gives me particular pleasure to introduce this year's E.H. Carr Memorial Lecture for two reasons. First, I've been organising this lecture series since 1999, and I think this is the first time that the name E.H. Carr has appeared in the title of the talk, so that gives me some pleasure. But the main pleasure is to welcome back to our former colleague, I was going to say former friend, but our constant friend, Professor Michael Cox from LSE now. Mick is probably one of the biggest friends the department has ever had. I'm sure he won't mind me telling you that he's the only person I know who has a framed copy in his house of the inspirational words of David Davis when he endowed, or promised to endow the department in November 1919. If anybody else has a framed copy, I'd like to know. This lecture series was started in 1984, 2 years after E.H. Carr died at the grand old age of 90. Carr was a controversial figure in many, many ways. The department, and the department decided that his life and work needed to be celebrated, and what better way to celebrate an intellectual than to name lecture series after him and get the best people available to give the talks. Over the years, this lecture series has been given by a veritable who's who of leading intellectuals who have got something to say about international politics. We've had key figures in international relations theory, W.T.R. Fox, John Mersheimer, Robert Keohane, Innes Claude, Stephen Walt, for example. We've had major historians like Margaret Macmillan a couple of years ago, Zara Steiner, Sir Michael Howard. We've had philosophers, sociologists, and others who've got some political theorists who've got something to say about international relations. Ernest Gellner, famous sociologist, international lawyer Marty Koskaniemi, philosopher Raymond Geuss, for example. So it's a really impressive list, and many people tell me that this is now the most prestigious named lecture series in the field anywhere. E.H. Carr, while he was here as the fourth Woodrow Wilson professor between 1936 and 1947, wrote some very impressive works, Nationalism and After, which I guess is going to figure in the talk, and of course the 20 Years Crisis, a book that was first published in 1939 and has never been out of print. Any serious Department of International Relations knows about the work and engages directly with the work of Carr in one way or another. So joining the impressive who's who of international relations this evening is our old friend Mick Cox. Mick was here between 1995 and 2001, and during that time his writing took off, and since that time he's been a prolific writer, a prolific talker, and a prolific traveller in the cause of promoting the areas that are particularly close to his heart. Cold War history, US foreign policy, relations amongst the big powers, the rise of Asia, power transition, and so on. He is presently an emeritus professor of international relations at LSE and the director of LSE Ideas, which is a university-based foreign policy think tank, and according to people who survey these things, is always in the top 5 or so in the world, and the highest, I think, it has been number 2 of university-based think tanks in the world. One of the things that Nick did when he was here was develop an interest in the work of E.H. Carr, and I think Nick probably knows more about E.H. Carr these days than anybody. During the time he was here, he edited a really excellent book called E.H. Carr, A Reappraisal, with some great essays in it. And since that time, he has edited 2 reprints of the 20 Years Crisis and produced a very, very helpful introductory set of essays setting the book in context and drawing out the implications of the book for the present time. And it's only about 2 years, 3 years ago that the second reprint of Carr's book came out with Nick's name somewhat prominently on the front. So, E.H. Carr, nationalism, the nation state, and the global crisis.
Yeah.
Can I ask you to give a big warm welcome to the return of Nick Cox.
Moving up with it. Right, can I start? Get off my screen. Anyway, thank you very much for those very kind words, Ken. It's very nice, inevitably, to be back here in my alma mater. I had a series of thanks here. One was to say thank you very much for inviting me to do this lecture this evening, because it had such a long, distinguished line of great speakers, and I was going to tell you who they were, but Ken just did it. But it has, and it is really a great honour to be in this long and distinguished list. The only thing you should call me now is number 35, so I think this is the 35th, Ken. But anyway, thank you very much. It is an extraordinary list of the great and the good and maybe not so good who've been involved in IR, many more, Jean Bethke Elstein. And the great-granddaughter, you should also add, Ken, you know that, David Lloyd George, no less, Margaret Macmillan, who spoke in the same series in 2016. So it is great to be back. I'm also bound to say thank you to Ken. Ken is not just a stalwart of this department, I kind of think he is the department. Ken, you've done so much for IR. I know you'll get very embarrassed, but I'm going to try and embarrass you. It's not very easy, I know. But I do want to say all the great things that you've done for this department and for the subject. And this year, many of you may know, but I'll tell you because I'm very good at promoting myself, so I'll promote Ken too. In June this year, Ken was awarded the BISA, that's the British International Studies Association, Distinguished Contribution Prize for the promotions of excellence over a substantial period of time in IR. And I think what you've achieved here, and more generally what this department has achieved over the 100 years of its existence, I think is extraordinary. There are a number of revisionist interpretations of IR out there, which I certainly do not share. I see this as the home of the discipline, This is where it was first taught as an academic subject. I was extraordinarily privileged to be here for the 6 to 7 years, and very privileged to come back. One of the things I did do here, and again, it's not promoting myself, I think it was in 1997, Ken, we brought out a short history of the department to commemorate the 125th anniversary. Is that working okay? No? Can you hear me okay? My voice is not very loud. Can you hear me in the back? Yeah, I've got a very loud voice. I'll shout, shall I? Anyway, that was great, and I learned so much about the department at the same time. I'm also bound to say something about David Davis. I don't mean the man who's associated with Brexit, but the real David Davis, the proper David Davis, the David Davis who, and the family of David, Margaret and Gwendolyn, because there were 2 sisters which I would need to mention here, who made it all possible. Ken said that I actually do have the original. It was appeared in the Times. I won't go into all of it. When I last read it out to some friends, we all started crying. Well, I think I did at least, because it's such an extraordinarily moving statement about what the purpose of our subject is, which is not just to publish and do referable stuff, but it is also to contribute to a better world. It was an extraordinary family, and it made an extraordinary contribution. It made a £20,000 bequest to build a better world. David Davis was later called by Brian Porter, who was almost the historian of David Davis in many ways, a rather remarkable guy, Brian Porter. He called David Davis a hunter after peace, which I thought was a very nice way of describing David Davis. And I'm really pleased that the connection remains, kept alive through this department, through the David Davis Memorial Institute. And one must hope that one day the David Davis and the family get the recognition they deserve from the college as well. And also, by the way, there is connection between David Davis and E.H. Carr, which I'll also mention en passant, because it's a very, very strange relationship. I suppose the question David Davis asked and answered when the appointment was made of Carr in 1936, what the hell are we doing appointing E.H. Carr? So I'll come on to that in a moment. Now, briefly on Carr, just to give you the biography, I don't want to go into this too much detail, there's lots on this. Carr, of course, was born in the late Victorian period, 1892. As I always say in the books, a stable middle-class background. I'm not sure what that means. I suppose it means if you come from the working class, it's unstable. I'm not too sure what it's meant by that. He attended Cambridge, naturally, where he read classics, naturally. He did the only thing I think he could do at the time, which was either to go off to become a poet like Houseman, who was a great inspiration to him, or joining the Foreign Office. A bright young man joined the Foreign Office in 1916, 2 years into World War I. He played several significant roles over the next 20 years in the Foreign Office. And the Foreign Office side is very, very important, by the way, and I'll bring it back. But the most significant role, which is often not stressed enough in the biographies and the history, there's only one biography, but in the history, is actually his role at the Paris peace negotiations. If you read a number of books on or references to Carr, they often say the impact of the Russian Revolution in 1917. I don't think that's quite so true. It did have a massive impact, but the biggest impact on Carr, and I'll talk about this in a bit more detail, was his experiences as a diplomat in Paris, in Versailles, trying to make the peace treaty. And that had an enormous, as it did indeed, on so many others who later went on either become critics or supporters of Woodrow Wilson and the League of Nations. He resigned from the Foreign Office. He wasn't kicked out or anything. He resigned in 1936 and he took up the Woodrow Wilson chair in 1936, which he finally resigned in 1947. There's a wonderful letter to Eva Evans, who was then the principal of the college in 1947, where he resigns. It's quite a moving letter because although Carl was not exactly here a lot of the time, he came 2 days a week, and he was not asked to be here any other one at the time, he nonetheless, I think, no doubt, really enjoyed the period he spent here. He settled back as a fellow in Cambridge, and finally died, as Ken pointed out, at the grand old age of 90, which of course we're all aspiring to do ourselves, aren't we, Ken? When he finally died, if you go through the obituaries of the time, one thing comes out clear. A, nobody could remember that he wrote on international relations, but everybody regarded him as one of the great public intellectuals of the post-war and the Cold War period.
he was described by A.J.P. Taylor as an Olympian of public intellectuals. In other words, I don't think he ever saw himself as a narrowly defined academic. He saw himself as somebody who was publicly engaged in the great debates of the day, particularly in his own day, in the post-Second World War period, in the period of the Cold War, and thinking about what the Cold War was about. And of course, being Carr, being a contrarian, he came up with views which were not exactly pro-Western, but not exactly also uncritically pro-Soviet either. By the time he died, again, how was Carr known then? But briefly taking some of his biography forward quickly, he was known for two things, to be perfectly honest, except outside of IR. But what he was known as more generally in the public was two things. One, what he was known for was writing 14 long, very detailed volumes on the history of early Soviet Russia. That's how I first got to know Carr intellectually. I started life, I was a Sovietologist. It sounds like a convention now, doesn't it? I started life as a Sovietologist in the Institute of Soviet and East European Studies up in Glasgow. And if you read early Soviet history, which most people don't do now, but if you did it then, and people did do it then you read Carr. That was the first thing you had to read. Now, if you read all 14 volumes, you were very well done. I never got through 14. He started them in 1945. And I think he was still writing these almost a few days before he finally, and that's what he was known for. He was known, therefore, for one of the biggest books in history, or volumes in history, and one of the shortest. And the shortest, of course, was What is History? That was his Trevelyan lectures, which he gave in '61. Which, of course, Macmillan were offered, by the way, as publishers. And Macmillan turned down on the grounds they didn't think it would sell. Publishers, yet again, get it wrong. It sold 250,000 copies and was translated into something like 24 languages. But that's what he was known for. The first set of books on Soviet Russia, now unread and much criticized as being far too sympathetic to the Bolshevik Revolution. You know, the post-Cold War era, the shift to the right intellectually in Soviet studies, which was now Russian studies, has basically demonized Carr and pushed him off the pedestal that he once occupied. The second book, What is History, of course, is still the primer. I mean, everybody goes to school, what is history? That's what you get to set you up to start thinking about methodology and historiography. Which brings me then to the question of Carr, Aberystwyth, and IR. Where does it fit in, you see? If you're standing there in 82 or 83, where does it fit in? Well, for people in IR, I suppose it fits in. But it also raises the question, why did Carr take the chair? Very briefly, it was an odd decision on both sides. Why was it a non-decision? Pretty clear. One, David Davis did not want him. He made it absolutely clear. He broke a stick, apparently, down wherever he was. He was so annoyed, and he resigned. The second thing was that the chair was named after an American president that Carr could not stand, called Woodrow Wilson. So, you get the problem here? And this was, in a sense, therefore, Carr was from day one a very controversial appointment for Davis. Actually, Ivor Evans, the then principal, stood by his academic credentials and said, this is basically the best person for this job, given both his experience and given the things that he has written altogether, and given also, let's be blunt, his intellectual wattage at the time. The basic answer why Carr came here is he said this quite clearly. I could have stayed on in the Foreign Office doing what I was doing, trying to speak truth to power, to use that old cliche, but he wanted to influence the debate about the world. And he wanted to influence the discussion about the world amongst what he called the reading public. And also, this was a book, although it looks like a very theoretically dense book, it was also a book written for policymakers as well, because it had a very clear policy prescription. Robert Cox, who sadly died earlier this year, I believe, once said that theory is always for someone or some purpose. And I think this is certainly true. Carr had a purpose when he came here, which was to write, to have the space to write, the space to think, which I'm afraid many academics today don't have, given all the other managerial things that are thrown at them. But nonetheless, that's why he came here to do it. And of course, 1939, 3 years later, saw the result in the appearance, almost on the eve of the Second World War, of course, the 20 Years' Crisis. By the way, I've said this before, it's just a little bibliographical detail, and I love this little bit bibliographical stuff. That wasn't the original title, as you all know. It was actually going to be called originally Ideology and Utopia, or Utopia and Ideology. His publisher was none other than Harold Macmillan, who later went on to become British Prime Minister. And Harold Macmillan said in this very, well, it's a very typical way of time, Carl, nobody's going to buy a book called Ideology and Utopia, dear boy. Call it something interesting. He actually said that. And then he came up with this title, 20 Years Crisis. Carl didn't like the title, by the way. He kind of went with it because he thought, well, you know, if Macmillan says it, it must be right. Anyway, yeah, Macmillan was right, the publisher was right, Carl was wrong, and the book came out. It provoked outrage and praise in equal measure. To be blunt, liberals hated the book. Almost without any, the whole liberal establishment who really hated it, but it established itself, of course, as the IR classic. Now, of course, before Carr came here, he wrote lots of interesting books, none on international relations. His first book was on Dostoevsky, a psychological study, think about that one. His second book was on revolutionary exiles, particularly Alexander Herzen. And his next book, which he thought was his worst, by the way, was on Karl Marx, which came out in 1934. And within a year of arriving here, he also wrote a fourth book outside of international relations on Michael Bakunin, the Russian anarchist. So there's a very interesting question to be asked here about utopianism, because this, of course, always comes up. You might say that each of these four great studies, they all are four outstandingly good books. The Bakunin book in particular is great, I think. Each of these are about, in a way, utopians, visionaries, people who sought in different ways to think about the world in critical ways. But as Ken also pointed out, when he did get here, leaving aside those other four studies, it was a massive output. You know, if you were the RAF Supremo of any department, E.H. Carr was your man. You know, I mean, it simply poured off his pen, and it was a pen, by the way, because nobody used computers in those days. The first book he published here, which also got translated into Welsh, by the way, was called International Relations Since the Peace Treaty, which, by the way, again, also has not gone out of print. That's an interesting thing. He then wrote a book in 1939. He wrote 3 books in 1939, by the way, appeared in the same years. There's the 20-year crisis, which you all know about. Another book appeared called Britain and Its Foreign Policy, which, by the way, had an introduction by Lord Halifax, the chief appeaser of the time. Interesting. And then, of course, in that year, he brought out a third book, which I'm going to talk about a bit tonight. I call it The Unknown Car. It's a book called Nationalism. This was a collective book that came out of a Chatham House study. Carr basically wrote it, I know, I've been through all the minutes. He really is essentially, if not the sole author, nonetheless, there's a lot of Carr in that book, and I'm going to claim it as one of his. And then in 45, as Ken said, Nationalism and After. Then in 1946, coming out of the war, when the Soviet Union was very, very popular, by the way, in the West, before the Cold War set in, he wrote a book called Soviet Impact on the Western World, which isn't as bad as people make it out to be. It's pro-Soviet, there's no question, but what he's looking at is the impact of the Soviet Union on the West, and how the West should respond to that. So it's a much more subtle book than it's usually caricatured as being. It's kind of Stalinist apologia, it's not. And then in 51, he brought out, I think, basically, I suppose you might say his last book, on international politics more generally. He'd always been interested inevitably in German-Soviet relations, and in 51, he brought out that book. By the way, most of these books which I just mentioned, with the exception of the 20 Years Crisis, are more or less out of print today, very difficult to get. And again, it tells you that the one book that did so well is that one on international relations between the two wars. A very excellent book, a masterpiece of balanced exposition, said Sir Harold Nicholson. And again, it was his own book which was translated into Welsh. Now, much of course has been written about Carr's contribution to IR, and I don't need to get into it in too much detail here. But there's something that does need to be reminded before I get on to talk more specifically on the nationalism question very quickly. It's quite remarkable, the book which we now regard as a classic, influential, serious, defining in many, many ways. Actually, if one looks at the reaction to the 20-year crisis, of course there were those who kind of really liked the book, particularly amongst the American realists, who I think fundamentally also misinterpreted it, but that's another question. But actually the overwhelming response to much of what Carr had written, particularly the 20 Years Crisis, was actually rather critical. I mean, for instance, just take 2 examples. Look at what Hans J. Morgenthau said about Carr in a very interesting article in World Politics in 1946, The Political Science of E.H. Carr. He praises him in the first 5 pages and then spends the next 10 pages attacking him for surrendering to the imminence of power. You know, this is just not a nice thing to say. And then, well, 20 years later, a person you may have heard of called Hedley Bull also wrote a lengthy article on Carr, 30 years after the 20 Years Crisis, which would hardly be regarded as friendly. Basically said the 20 Years Crisis is irrelevant, tells us nothing about the modern world today. Oh, and by the way, Carr is not a member of the English school, which was self-evidently true. So, you know, it's actually interesting to see that until the 70s and 80s and 90s, there was actually a lot more criticism of Carr than there was acceptance. You know, I think we get this view now that we had this classic, it got reprinted, or second edition in 45 came out, and therefore it spread around the whole discipline. I think there was deep resistance to the book within IR, for whether from Morgenthau or whether it was from the English school people like Martin White and Hedley Bull. And also there was a lot of other criticism directed against Carr. I think again we've got to remember how the book was so controversial. People didn't like his foreign policy preferences in the 30s, appeasement. Somebody later argued, I think it was W.T.R. Fox, said that Carr tampered with the first edition to delete some of the embarrassing bits which had been in the first edition, particularly about Sudetenland and Germany. And they didn't like his views on the Soviet Union. I'd have to say this, and I'm going to embarrass Ken yet again, I hope. That actually there were 2 articles, I think, this is my own personal opinion, which I think renegotiated a proper intellectual relationship with Carr. One was written by a very nice guy, again, very sad, Graham Evans. He wrote a wonderful piece on E.H. Carr and international relations, I thought anyway, in 1975. And I'm about to say this, that Ken, I think, actually redefined what we should be talking about in Carr in your piece, Security and Anarchy. And I think what happened in the 90s, which is very interesting why it happened, IR had really been quite defensive against Carr thus far, with the exception of the American realists who adopted him, but only took what they wanted to take from him, I've always thought. But then I think there was an opening, which happened in the 90s, maybe because of the end of the Cold War, I don't know. So while he's in a sense being ignored increasingly for the work he did in Soviet studies, he's being increasingly recognized for his work in international relations in the 1990s. It's an interesting kind of parallelism of 2 entirely different ways of thinking about it. And of course, we had the works in 98, Charles Jones, Jonathan Hassan's biography, Tim Dunn's work on inventing international science, my own critical approach, and a veritable Carr industry which has since followed. Duncan Bell has talked of a great historiographical term, and part of that clearly has benefited Carr. But in all or most of this new work, to come really to the point of this lecture, sorry for the throat clearing exercise, but in all or most of this new work, what I found, and maybe I'm not reading the right things, I'm not going to the right places or talking to the right people, there's much less discussion of Carr's reflections on nationalism and the nation state, I found, as part of the purpose of doing what I'm doing here tonight. For instance, I've already mentioned, there's little discussion at all as far as I can see, and I may have missed something along the way, quite possibly, of the time he spent working over 3 years on a Chatham House study group on nationalism. I've been through all the minutes of Chatham House, you know, I'm a historian really, I'm an IR person who likes history, you've got to like both. But it's quite amazing, I've been through the minutes of Chatham House, through 36, 37, 38, 39. Carr is down there most weeks, bringing in people to talk about nationalism with him. All the great writers on nationalism, both in this country and abroad, all trying to work out what nationalism means, how it's come into being, how nationalism evolved from the kind of Rousseau version of it, to German romantic nationalism, to the version that it was taking in the 20th century. It's a remarkable study. Unfortunately, it's written by committee, but in the end, the book finally appeared in '39, and the chair of this was Carr, and most of the key things in it going on after. That's 3 years. In other words, what I want to say, and this is significant, I think, Carr, in effect, became an expert on nationalism, specifically on nationalism, while he's also writing the 20 Years Crisis. You know, it's not the one is just there and there's another one over here. He's actually doing 2 things in parallel. And I think this is deeply significant. And the book, although it's not the easiest book to read, given the way it's been constructed, nonetheless, it's a deeply erudite study of the history of nationalism, the evolution of nationalism, and what nationalism means across several countries. I think equally, again, I may be exaggerating this for purposes of presentation, but nonetheless, I think equally less attention has been paid to what he has to say about the nation state in the 20 years crisis. I think much less has been, we've had several debates of, was there even a great debate? How many times do we need to go back over that one? You know, what did Karl really mean? How much was he influenced by Karl Mannheim? Also, that was an important question. What was his nature and notion of power? Why was he so unfair on the liberals and the League of Nations? And what did he mean by utopianism? I think this is diverted us away from what's actually in the book, if I might be blunt about it. Because a lot about the nation state in the 20 years crisis, particularly towards the end. In 1942, by the way, he talks in a book which is, again, not read enough, The Conditions of the Peace, which I think is an extraordinarily good book, by the way. And he talks in one of the chapters of a crisis of self-determination. You know, now that's putting it straight on the line. Then, of course, comes his short but powerful book, Nationalism and After, which came out in 1945, in which he predicted or anticipated a world order where nations would assume far less significance. Indeed, I think he was hoping for their ultimate withering away over the very long time. This was then followed by his remarkable new preface, and it is a remarkable new preface to the second edition of the 20 years crisis, where he makes it clear that there can be, and I quote, no workable international organisation could be built, quote, on a multiplicity of nation states. By 1945, I think Karl was in no doubt, wherever he started. And this, you can see this clearly implicit even in the 20 years crisis going back 5-6 years earlier. The future did not belong to nation states, especially small nation states. I'll say something about that. The future belonged to what you might call the big battalions, or what he termed ever larger political and economic units. So I think really, I'm not trying to reinterpret Karl yet again, people can do that forever, but I do think some part of the debate and the interpretation, the way we've constructed the debate around Karl, I've talked about so many other things about Karl, but I think in a way we need to get back to what I think is much more central about Karl, about thinking about the principal unit in international system and about nationalism and what it means for world order and international order. And indeed in the last chapter, which couldn't have been read by the American readers, they must have deleted it from their editions because they don't read it. There it is. He talks quite clearly. He's open. He's not entirely certain. You know, it could go one way, it could go another, but there's clearly a sense that if you're going to get international order, or just order as well, to replace a disaster which has become the part of the 20th century, the crisis, then something clearly must see a fundamental change, both in the nation state as the institution of the international system, and indeed moving to a post-national world. Nationalism and After, that's the title. It's a very short book, but it tells its own story. Now, there has been some discussion about this. I don't want to exaggerate. I haven't suddenly discovered something which nobody else has ever talked about. I'm not quite suggesting that. I'm simply saying it's not been talked about enough, or discussed enough, or explained enough. Ernest Gellner, whom you mentioned here, actually did do an E.H. Carr lecture here in 1992, called Nationalism Reconsidered and E.H. Carr. It's actually a pretty good lecture, I think. And he actually admits then in 1992, more or less what I'm saying today. He says in that lecture, Carr's work on nationalism has suffered from neglect. And this is one of the key writers on nationalism. Ernest Gellner was, one of the great modernist analysts of nationalism. He receives little note in our recent discussions of nationalism. And by that stage, there's enormous literature on nationalism by 1992, including Gellner. It seems to have been forgotten. And that is unjust. He then goes on to criticize himself. Ernest Gellner wasn't very good at criticizing himself, by the way. He admitted to having almost forgotten Carr's most significant volume on the subject, Nationalism and After, although he thought it might have influenced him somewhat. He was honest enough to say that, by the way. Things then improved thereafter. Other writers have come to look at this issue, and I'll say it's not just me today. Andrew Linklater's work, of course, significant in this, contribution by cosmopolitan theorists like David Held, Peter Wilson of the LSE, has examined Carr's thinking about the future of sovereignty in post-Second World War Europe. But I still think it's unexplored territory. That's what I'm trying to get at here. It's been explored, but not enough. I then asked a series of questions, which I'll run over very quickly, which I don't think need to be gone into. Why is there this neglect? I remember Steve Smith, when he was here, always asked the question about, if there is a silence, why is there a silence? That sort of question. I don't think it's been a complete silence, but why? And we've kind of gone round the problem a bit more than we should have done, I think, in spite of the great work of Andrew and others. Well, I think actually part of realism is to blame. I mean, a particular kind of crude reductionist realism. I mean, what do realists say? Well, Carl was a realist, don't you know? John Mearsheimer reminded of that in an article he wrote. Realists don't speculate about the future, and realists accept the nation state as a permanent and actual fact of life. I mean, that's it. You know, it's the permanence, it's the repetition, which I think almost goes completely against Carl, by the way. I'd also say, secondly, because I think maybe it's more interesting, I think nationalism and IR have had a very weird relationship. There's lots and lots of literature out there on nationalism. You can't believe it, unbelievable number of books on nationalism. Trying to work out, is it modern, is it ancient, you know, does nationalism come before the nation state, etc., etc., the relation of nations and economy. There's a massive literature out there on nationalism. There's journals galore out on nationalism. But I still would suggest has had a problem with nationalism. If you actually look at the literature, it's not very thick on the ground. I go back to F.H. Hinsley's work. There's been other works on international society and the nation state, James Mayle. There's been other works, particularly in the 90s, around identity issues and nationalism. But nonetheless, I still kind of take the view that IR and nationalism have had a rather problematic relationship. That's the take I'm arguing. I've argued this in an article which I hope is going to appear in Ken's journal very soon, the Journal of International Relations, that if IR is largely, has been primarily about thinking about order, then nationalism is a problem because it's very disorderly. You know, it may not fit into that, that kind of narrative about order. The other reason I think, and this was told to me by John Broyley, who's written some wonderful stuff on nationalism over the years, he actually said, well, Carl was just wrong. He just got it wrong. Nationalism didn't go away, the nation state didn't fade, so why bother to study something? You quite clearly got it all wrong. So there's a kind of, this IR guy came along, played around in the nationalism literature which he didn't fully understand, and he got it wrong. Because if you look at the world's composed of nation states, nationalism hasn't disappeared, etc., etc., etc. So, what I'm going to try and do is try and reconstruct, here we go, why Carl did arrive at the position he did on nation states, nationalism, and self-determination. And I think what I want to start with is not a series of events, which I will do in a moment on Paris, but look at also what I would call Carl's theory of history, or Carl's understanding of world history. Now again, this is simply a reconstruction, so not all the details are going to be there. What was Carl's theory of history, and how does the problem of nations and nationalism fit into it? Well, I think Carl, like nearly everybody of the 20th century, saw a very clear dividing line in history with a big H. And he was not alone in doing so. And that dividing line is, on one side stands the 19th century, understood as meta-history. The long peace, if you like, underwritten by free trade, and in Britain at least by laissez-faire economics. This was an age of empire, as Eric Hobsbawm has put it, but it was also, as Carl understood it, and indeed did so many other writers, it was an age of economic progress, where states were losing, and nation states were losing the propensity for war, as they more and more traded with each other. Great power war, although they occurred on the periphery, if you wish, nonetheless, great power war was a thing of the past. It seemed inconceivable to many writers thinking as Carl does about the 19th century. We all know that we should know the name Norman Angell, and then people always say, well, he wrote this book in 1910 called The Great Illusion. Wasn't he a silly man? Well, no, he wasn't actually. By the way, he didn't say what was impossible. What he said economically, the pressures of commerce and all the rest, meant the world would be economically mad, if you wish. And Angell's view, I think, was actually much more dominant regarding thinking about the 19th century than he wasn't standing alone in this particular debate. it was also an age, and again, Carr reflects on the 19th century a lot in his works, by the way, contrasting the 19th century order. It's an oversimplification, without doubt, but he reflects on this order. He said also it was an order in which liberalism and nationalism made easy bedfellows. And not in all countries, to be sure, least of all in Germany, right-wing German Romanticism, but in many, the cause of freedom and the cause of nationality went together, as they did in Hungary in the mid-century, in Poland in the mid-century, and later on, of course, with the Risorgimento in Italy. To put it another way, and this, of course, is very much the influence of Rousseau on that kind of thinking, and on nationalism and thinking about the 19th century, the rights of nations linked to the rights of man, as to put it in that particular form. Now, this period of history, as Carr constructs it, obviously came to an end in 1914. And the failure then was it could never be put back together. The 19th century was over. That's the way he constructs it. No going back. Carr's equilibrium, like that of the world around him, had been undermined forever. No putting it back. And I think his own thinking about the world was further dislodged after the war by discovering 19th century Russian intellectuals. I think he discovered 19th century Russian intellectuals before he came to terms with the Bolshevik Revolution, by the way. That had an equally disturbing effect on his thinking. And he actually admits to that later on. It's only in the 30s, I think, that he really comes around to appreciate the importance of the Soviet Union, interestingly. The Soviet experience, the experiment of the 1930s, the 5-year plan. Why does he come around to it by the 30s? Because of the collapse of capitalism, in fact, with the Great Depression. Now, in these disturbing times, Carr clearly comes under the influence of many new ideas. Lenin, by the way, gets quoted a lot in the 20 Years' Crisis. Interesting footnote. Reinhold Niebuhr, Karl Mannheim, of course, but also the other Karl Marx. And I want to suggest, and again, maybe I'm not saying anything terribly original here tonight, I think that actually the influence of Marx on Carr, although he himself admitted it when he came to the 20 Years' Crisis, he actually called it my most Marxist work. Nonetheless, I think the influence of Marx on Carr is actually more than some, I think, talked about. And more than sometimes Carr talks about. I don't know. But Carr did not accept all of Marx, that's for sure. In his own book on Karl Marx, he's quite clear. Labour theory of value, rubbish. Dictatorship of the proletariat, don't want it. He didn't even like the class struggle. Imagine Carr in the class struggle. You just take one picture of Carr. Does he look like a man who stands outside factories handing out leaflets and going on demonstrations? I don't think so. But nonetheless, I think he absorbed an enormous amount from Marx, almost like a process of osmosis. Later on in one of the obituaries, I can't remember who said it, he said that Carr absorbed too much historical materialism ever to be acceptable to the British establishment. And I think there's some truth in that, and that's what I want to kind of suggest here. Because I think what he took from Marx, and this does get back to nations and nationalism, that history basically is always unfinished. History is not about repetition, a la the classical realist. It's not about cycles either. History does not repeat itself. Nothing is permanent. That's the fundamental way I think Marx, taking this from Hegel, I think thinks. Marx says it very clearly in the Great Communist Manifesto. All that is solid melts into air. Marx also influenced Carr to see the world as a struggle between the haves and the have-nots. That comes out clearly in the 20 Years' Crisis. And also to be critical of the status quo. I mean, Marxism is nothing that's not critical of the status quo, whichever status quo it happens to be. Not only that, I think Marx also got Carr more and more to look behind truth claims, to the power that lay behind those claims, which included the truth claims made by liberals in 1919 about building a new world order on liberal principles. I think this shapes Carr's thinking on nations and nationalism profoundly. Most obviously, Carr himself, and this is why the idea that he's kind of a classical realist in the traditional sense. Carr actually also accepts that nothing remains the same forever. He made it quite clear in the 20 Years' Crisis. Few things are permanent in history, quote, including the nation state. It's not some fixed thing outside of time. And as times change, the nation state would inevitably change as well. He says it again in the 20 Years Crisis. It would be a mistake to treat the nation as the ultimate group of human society. Again, that's in the 20 Years Crisis. Equally, nationalism, which he had seen as being, broadly speaking, progressive, like liberal, associated with rights of man, rights of nations, and all the rest of it, that had changed its character too after 1914, into becoming what he termed in Nationalism Study of 1939, a potential threat to civilization. At least that form of nationalism, of the ethnic and chauvinistic kind, the kind that had taken over most of Europe by the end of the 1930s. So the first thing I want to argue, really, I think methodologically, historically, the kind of way that Carl looks at the world leads him to kind of think of the nation state in transition, not as something fixed, and to think of nationalism, which for one stage, 19th century, particularly the influence of the French Revolution, Rousseau's and Antism, as something which is not fixed either. It could be progressive at one point in time, but by the 20th century, not surprisingly by the end of the 1930s, given what was happening across Europe, thinking it was deeply regressive, deeply dangerous, and deeply disturbing to any sense of international order, and even to a just order as well. So in one sense, I think Carl's thinking on nations and nationalism had, or has what I call deep theoretical historical roots. The root being, I think, largely in the context of the times in which he's living, but also, I think, deeply influenced by Marx himself. But this was not all. Carl was, I think the 20th Crisis is a wonderful work of theory, but Carl also, he goes back to the Foreign Office, and that's what I want to bring you back to quickly. He'd also been very much involved in more practical ways with looking for solutions to practical problems when working in the Foreign Office, and most significantly, when working in Paris in 1919. Now, I've gone back and looked at this, and maybe others have done this. There's something in Jonathan Haston's own biography on this. There are other things too you could look at. But I've gone back and looked at this in some detail, and I think you've got to go back to Paris, you've got to go back to Versailles, and to see what Carl was doing there in a very practical way, why this led him to be highly critical of what we would call nation states, nationalism, and the principle of self-determination. Long before, by the way, he discovered Marx, it has to be said, and long before the world crisis of the 1930s. I think many of his ideas and attitudes towards nationalism, nationalists, and the then influential idea that all nations had a right to self-determination were formed and shaped. Background. London in late 1980 sent over as many officials and even historians as possible to Paris. The best and the brightest went to Paris, including, by the way, the first two Woodrow Wilson professors here, Alfred Zimmern and Charles Webster. It also included the fourth WW professor, E.H. Carr, who was also there. Right. Carr was appointed British Secretary to the formally constituted Committee on New States. That was his job. He was given a job by a man called James Headland Morley. Carr, he said, go and sort out the new states. The new states were, of course, the new successor states of the now defunct Austro-Hungarian Empire, and all those new states that had broken away from the old imperial power of Russia. Carl was a crucial player on this committee, by the way. I kind of looked at this and could he have played such a big role? Well, the answer is that he did. I mean, he did play the big role in the economics, that was Keynes and all sorts of other things. But and Carr's benefactor, then James Headland Morley, admitted there was much for Carr, his assistant, to do on the committee. It certainly was. Drafting memos and doing all sorts of other things besides, including, by the way, dealing on directly with Woodrow Wilson, someone who was not easy to warm to, and that's an understatement. As well as with the many new leaders of the new nations like Poland, whom Carr had to meet on a regular basis. These were not meetings which much endeared Carr to the nationalist or the other way round. Carr indeed seemed to suffer, as indeed did nearly everybody in Paris throughout these turbulent days, from serious stress. In March 1919, I've got a lot more detail on this, but I won't go into it. In one letter it says, Carr has gone to bed. This at a time when there are ongoing discussions with the Polish delegation about the future of Poland. So the Polish question drove him to bed for 2 days. In fact, if you simply skim through the debates within the committee, and there's some wonderful stuff there, if you really want to get into it, it's terrific stuff. There always is a conflict going on between the great powers like Britain, of which Carl was represented, and the new states themselves. the new states objected strongly to being told what to do by the great powers, and certainly didn't like the great powers interfering into their internal affairs. They were, after all, nationals. The great powers, in turn, did not trust the leaders of any of the new states, who they feared would, amongst other things, not be as sensitive as they needed to be about the rights of their own minorities. Most immediately, the Jewish minorities in Eastern Europe, but even more problematically then, the German minorities scattered all over Central Europe. They had good reason to be worried, which is why they wanted a minorities treaty. How well this treaty worked is very much open to question, as we now know. Poland, by the 1920s, was planning but failed to expel all ethnic Germans from Poland. By the way, after World War I, as you know, Poland received many lands from Germany, inherited 2.1 million Germans. But between 1926 and 1933, Germany repeated, this is liberal democratic Weimar Germany notice, repeatedly appealed to the League of Nations to force Poland to uphold the treaties it had signed which protected the minorities. They made more appeals on this question than any other country, by the way, Germany did on the minorities question. And then, of course, there was the Czechoslovak situation, where the situation wasn't quite so bad at first, but decidedly got dangerous in the 30s when Hitler assumed power and played the oppressed German card in Czechoslovakia very successfully. No justification for Hitler, of course. However, the Sudeten Germans did have legitimate grievances with the government, and they complained they had insufficient work, not represented in the military and all the rest. That lay in the future. In 1919, meantime, Karl was trying to do in Paris was to try and reconcile these competing claims. That is to say, the claim of the new nations to self-determination, and on the other hand, the claim of minorities to be protected from the governments of the new states that were coming into being. And for the great powers, this wasn't just a moral issue. This was a security question, because a failure to solve the minorities question would only lead over time, as indeed we now know it did in the 1930s, to further disasters. Karl soldiered on through 1919. He also visited Poland in 1920. There's a wonderful story about him going to Poland. He wrote a powerful attack on the Polish government and their failure on the question of Jewish minorities, by the way, and also on German minorities. But at that stage, the Foreign Office didn't want to listen to him because they were more interested in bolstering Poland as a bulwark against communism than they were about worrying too much about the nationalities issue itself, or the minorities issue. Now, the impact of all this on Karl, just to sum up, is pretty damn obvious. First, it made Karl highly critical of the one politician in Paris at the time who seemed to champion the new states, whose difficult and argumentative leaders Karl had to be in contact with every day. And who was that? The liberal leader of America, Woodrow Wilson. I think Karl's hostility to Wilson was ideological, but it was also very personal too. In fact, most of the British delegates in Paris, and this is a kind of more general sociology of the delegates in Paris, all came away disliking Woodrow Wilson. And the one who came away disliking him the most, by the way, was John Maynard Keynes. If you read the economic consequences of the piece, boy oh boy, what that says about Wilson is almost unprintable. Of course, Keynes went ahead and printed it. Then there was the very thorny question of self-determination. Nice general liberal principle. But Karl came to reject it root and branch. And you can see why from the experiences of Paris, why he did. It failed to address the minorities issue. The issue became more intractable. It didn't lay the basis of any order. And of course, over time, he thought that in the end, it led to economic disaster in Central Europe, which in fact it did. Self-determination as a political principle did not lead to economic progress, quite the reverse. As the old empire fragmented, it declined economically, and by the way, by the 1930s, was very open to the depredations of another big power rising at the time, namely Nazi Germany. So you can see both from the theoretical, historical sense, and from the specific examination I'm trying to do here, on the work that Karl did, you can actually see, therefore, given all this thing, pulling it together, why Karl, therefore, became so critical of the principle of self-determination, nation-states, and nationalism. It goes back deeper, and it's not just a theoretical issue. But where does all this leave us? And I'll bring my comments now to a conclusion. Was Karl right or wrong? Is there anything to be learned? What are the takeaways? Well, I suppose the first thing to say, by way of conclusion, to confess to you even, as I'm in Wales, is that Carr really has little to say that is positive about small nations, and does not display much sensitivity towards them, you might say. In essence, he thinks they can only prosper and move forward as part of something much bigger. So I'll be honest about it, I can't imagine supporters of Welsh or Scottish independence much like in Carr. I can take that one on the chin, I think. I think the second problem is, in a way, Carr's predilection for larger units and his opposition to self-determination did in the end lead him, and one's got to admit to this, one's not uncritical of Carr, but lead him to a very problematic position when it came to Eastern Europe after the war, when it came under the rule of the USSR. A large unit, if ever there was one, which Carr basically thought was a good progressive move, by the way, but which certainly did not have much time for the liberal principle of self-determination. Which, of course, then led people to say, well, Carr had appeased Nazi Germany, now he can appease another great power called Soviet Russia. Yet Carr did, I think, in spite of all that, and many, many other things we can discuss, did, I think, point to something really important about the international system and the conditions for order. Carr indeed may have rationalised Soviet rule in Eastern Europe, but it is also worth noting at the same time that he argued for a new Europe after World War II, which in time segued into the European community and finally into the European Union. Let me put it no blunter. Carr would not have voted for Brexit. I know, he told me. But logically and theoretically, it's an impossibility given his own views about the future of Europe as an integrated unit. He also warned against nationalism and excessive nationalism. The sort on display in his own times, the kind of nationalism that later led to thousands of deaths in former Yugoslavia in the 1990s, and in a less vicious but still dangerous form, which is beginning to tear our world apart today. Carr in 1945 talked of a new world that would hopefully transcend nationalism. The fact that it has not yet says less, I think, about or against Carr's cosmopolitan vision than the limits of our own political imagination. Carr had imagination. Another writer at the time who also had imagination was a contemporary of Carr's, and they didn't get on very well. That was Arnold Toynbee. No great fan of Carr. But this is what Toynbee said in 1967. The challenge of our times, argued Toynbee, the great historian of civilizations, is to break with the habit of nationalism and subordinate our nationalism to a larger loyalty of mankind. Indeed, our only chance of survival, said Toynbee, in the modern world is to forget the distance between insiders and outsiders and form a new habit of regarding others as members of our family. Visionary, undoubtedly, utopian, possibly. But in a world today where there are those promising to make America great again, who in China have called upon the Middle Kingdom to fulfill its own nationalist dream of becoming a serious rival to the same United States, and who in Europe and in this deeply divided country of ours are talking of taking back control of the nation by keeping out the outsider and the foreigner. Perhaps vision and utopia are no bad thing. Perhaps Carr was right all along. Thank you very much for listening.
Well done.
Go 2-1 for that. Okay.
We have about 25 minutes to follow up some of those moderate remarks. Who'd like to begin?
I asked myself a question.
Yeah, very selfish question, but it's something I'm interested in, would like to know more about. You mentioned 2 early Wilson chairs in Webster and Zimmern, both of whom ended up working in First World War in ways that brought them into contact with Weizmann, and then they're very sympathetic to it.
Yeah, designers and so on.
Yeah,
sure.
You mentioned Toynbee, very much on the other end of the spectrum. I had a great debate with her on Jewish civilization as a fossil and all that. And you mentioned that Carr had in the context of his work in minorities in Eastern Europe, a concentration on interest in Jewish minorities. Did he have a view on the Jewish question in relation to Zionism? If he did, what was it?
Well, firstly, yeah, I mean, on the issue of Jewish question, I always use this example, but it's only one example. It may not be the best example in the world. Carl, personally, given he was such a contrarian, as you can imagine, and was so critical of nearly everybody, he kind of had a few friends, but he didn't have many. But by far and away, his closest intellectual friend and closest friend personally was Isaac Deutscher, who we worked with throughout, in fact, going back to 45, when Isaac wrote a book on Stalin, and then wrote on other issues, of course, trilogy on Trotsky and many others, and then died in 67, 68. Everything, that we know, about Carl, I mean, there wasn't a shred of anti-Semitism about him. I think he had an enormous regard for Jewish intellectuals, for the contribution. Karl Marx, after all, came out of a certain tradition of intellectual, and I think in that sense, and I think he also, he doesn't say this, but it's kind of implicit, it's kind of a notion that the Jewish people as universalists, promoting certain universalist principles. I think that's implicit. I don't want to read too much into all this, because he doesn't speak about this in enormous detail at all. I think he also thought, and this may be a very controversial thing to say here, again, not being moderate, I think he also thought the Soviet Union, even though there was anti-Semitism in the Soviet Union, and even though Stalinism itself contained within it certain sort of, particularly in Stalin's later life, the Soviet Union, in a way, was much more attractive to Jewish intellectuals than, obviously Nazis or the alternative. So I think in that regard, on that, I think he sees himself as a universalist, and I think he certainly regards the great Jewish intellectuals of history through Spinoza, through Marx, and indeed Trotsky, about whom he was rather sympathetic, interestingly. In his great book in the best book in his 14 volumes is the Interregnum, where he discusses Trotsky versus Stalin. There's no question that he sees Stalin as an incipient anti-Semite and nationalist, by the way, and he sees Trotsky, as in says the opposite. On the question of Israel and the formation of Israel, I actually have not come across what he said about that. But given what he's obviously said against nationalism more generally, it would be, I'd have to go and look at this, by the way, but I haven't found anything where he expresses any great views about the foundation of the state of Israel. But he's certainly, on the other issues, I think he's a bit more clear.
Just in passing, the third Woodrow Wilson professor went to Paris as well.
Oh, did he?
As well as the first and second.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't want to leave out.
He was with the American delegation.
Green. Mr. Green, yeah. The man who was so surprised to get the chair. Yeah, indeed.
Sorry, I thought you had your hand up. Yeah?
Yeah. What do you think, or maybe what do you think Carl would have thought about the idea that this resurgence of nationalism we're seeing is perhaps comparable to, say, monarchies becoming absolutist before nationalist republics became institutions, and it's the kind of last gasp?
Yeah, maybe. It is in that book on nationalism, which he was very much involved in composing, writing, and chairing. In 1939, he reflects there, saying, well, nationalism may be just at its height and it's going to decline. Well, that's about the worst prediction, I think, that Carl ever made. But with the current, well, it's very difficult to know what Carl would have said after all. The man's been dead for several years. Well, I think first and foremost, I think given what he said about nationalism in the past, I think pretty clear what he would have said about it. I made that throwaway comment about Brexit. Impossible to conceive of Carl ever voting other than to remain, and certainly not voting for leaving the European Union. Was your question, would this be the last gasp of nationalism? Is that the one?
Yeah.
Well, but Eric Hobsbawm, who's a man a historian I seriously admire. There's a new biography coming out, by the way, soon by Richard Evans. Eric Hobsbawm in 1990, and again, many what I call universalists, mainly socialists and others, liberals, have often said, oh, it's the last gasp of nationalism. And Eric Hobsbawm, by the way, in his own book on nationalism, I don't think it's in his book on history, but it's somewhere, he says, don't worry, nationalism is going away. You know, it's the last flush. About 1990, he makes this point. I remember doing this in this paper I did for Ken. And, you know, I mean, what a useless prediction, you know, because, you know, suddenly you get the breakup of former Yugoslavia, you know, driven by strong nationalist, ethnic nationalist ideologies. Then you get the breakup of the Soviet Union, again, driven by many things. Central to that is nationalism. And then, so we've always, but this is the problem, and this is the problem about Carr, really, and that's why I asked him, was Carr wrong? You know, because he's kind of always hoping that, you know, processes of history, economics, the logic of large units, etc., are always going to undercut what he conceives ultimately to be an historical relic, really, from a previous 19th century order, which doesn't deserve to survive. But it constantly keeps coming back. And I suppose the one question he didn't ask, maybe he should have done, and others like John Broyley and others have asked this question, why does this strong sense of identity keep resurfacing? Which again, it is now doing again. And I don't have an easy answer to that, to be perfectly honest. I'm not sure Carr would have done. All I know is that Carr would have taken a clear normative position on it, and I think that's, he would have understood it, but I think he would have taken a clear normative position. This is going to lead us into disaster. It's not going to be a repetition of the 1930s. I don't think we're going back there. I think analogies with that kind of, you know, we're going back to the 30s, I think don't work. But I think, as I made my slightly rhetorical conclusion, I think we are moving into an age of greater nationalism, obvious nationalist populism, the appeal of sovereignty. All these things are coming back time and again to, you know, undermine order, and I think we are actually. I don't exaggerate. I don't think we're in the 1930s, but I think we are in a deeply dangerous moment. Yeah, and I think it's going to become more dangerous. And Carr is a warning about that.
I wonder what you think. What would you say? How would Carr view the contemporary form of the EU, and how far it's gone so far?
Well, again, it's always difficult to know what a dead man would think, I suppose. But let me put myself in E.H. Carr. I've been called E.H. Cox sometimes too. He's never been called Michael Carr or Mick Carr. In Conditions of the Peace in 1942, one of the superb parts of that book is where he looks at the future of Europe. I think this is a really, I mean, there's so much in that book, by the way, which we should know more about. And he looks at the future of Europe, and he looks at a new Europe, which has got to go beyond the old Europe, which, you know, was a disaster, both before and after the First World War, and then in the interwar period. And he was a genuine European federalist. Peter Wilson, in an excellent chapter in a book somewhere 10 years ago, and I wish it was known better, looks actually at this European ideal in British political thinking, not just in Monet, you know, the obvious candidates for European kind of senses of the future. And he deals with Carr, which I think is very well done, and Carr does deal with this. He deals with it first in Conditions of the Peace, where he looks forward to a complete reconstruction of Europe, supposedly largely Western Europe in this regard, after World War II, on non-national grounds. This is the only logical and rational way forward for Europe. And I don't want to say, look, Carr predicted the Treaty of Rome, predicted the European Economic Community, and then the European Union, but it looks to me dead like it. It does look like what Carr is saying does actually turn out to be something close to what Carr had said would have to happen in Europe if A, Europe was to prosper, B, France and Germany weren't to go to war with each other all the time, and you're going to have the stability and order. And I kind of think that Carr is a fantastic Europeanist. So much has been written about what he said about the Soviet Union and the problematic relationship with the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. And I accept some of the criticisms. I think he still wrote some very great things on the Soviet Union, by the way, the early history. I think it's still a great history. But nonetheless, I think that's a very interesting area that needs to be explored, because I think that's where you see his critique of nationalism taking a concrete solution. You know, a real solution, not just a theoretical one, but there is a concrete way forward to move beyond the nation state, to move beyond nationalism, which had delivered disaster for Europe since the outbreak of the First World War. Yeah, and that's why I said rather flippantly, but I think truly I can never imagine Carr voting
for Brexit. He certainly wouldn't have voted for the other David Davis, that's for certain.
Yeah, in relation to the progressive view of history that he has,
Yes.
that you mentioned, wouldn't he see the way Europe had gone over the last half century as actually representing some progress, not as far as he would have liked, but some progress? In the last few pages of the 20 Years Crisis, he talks about the desirability of spreading community across Europe, and explicitly says something along the lines of, you know, we'll know when we're getting there, when, he's talking about people in Britain, regard people who live in Dusseldorf, and he mentions somewhere in Poland as well, and somewhere in Poland, and he says when we regard those sorts of places as being the same as we regard people in Jarrow and wherever, maybe Oldham, I can't remember. So in that sense, the 48-52 split, there are 48% of the population, you know, in 2016 who have seen themselves in some sense as European citizens with that sense of community, which in 1939 would not have been the case.
No.
So in that sense, that fits in
directly. In fact, some of those last pages of the first edition of the Trade are quite inspirational. You know, when he's actually looking forward, not the rest of it has its strengths and has some weaknesses, but I think that last part of it, I think it's truly inspirational, and actually it's kind of foretelling, you know, the necessity of, and it's also solutions. I mean, this is the other point. I think you made this in your 1991 piece, Ken. You know, you've got to base a solution, your utopia, in a realistic analysis of where we are. You know, you can't just pick it out of your head. And I think that's what I think Carl was trying to do, really, when it comes into Nationalism and After and in the conditions of the piece. Here is what we've had, and we've got to think through a way out of the extraordinary dilemmas of nationalism and nation states and the anarchy and the ethno-nationalism, which has produced, you know, the interwar crisis, which he wrote about in 1939. And I think, you know, in that regard, I think I don't again, you asked me to talk about what a dead man might be thinking these days. I would suspect that he thought it had been too much of a compromise with sovereignty. I suspect that he would have said, I kind of think he might have in the end said, well, I think you kind of got to bite the bullet and go a little bit further. You know, you've gone part of the way. I think probably he would have been a federalist. So now, of course, if you kind of believe in the nation state and the Europe of nation states, you're not going to like Carl very much. I think I don't know. Okay, I mean, I'm only kind of speculating there. But I think what's the crucial point here to make is how Carl did foresee a new kind of Europe, not just the kind of Europe dominated by Eastern Europe, dominated by the Soviet Union, but also the kind of Europe that has emerged, which of course there is now a reaction against, as we well know, across the EU, particularly in this country. And the other thing I'd actually add, and again I'll be very political on this, I mean, the nationalist reaction or the sovereignist or nativist reaction to the European experiment or to the European Union, which has gone on in this country, is going to lead, I think, to what Carl would have anticipated, namely massive problems. You know, once you've integrated into something which is integrated, which is delivered on many public goods of peace, prosperity, democracy, and by the way, improved living standards, and improved progressive living standards, and on worker standards, and all sorts of other things, you pull out of that, and you know, which is essentially what Brexit is trying to do, whether it's going to happen is another question, then the consequences you're going to face as a result are going to be retrogressive politically, they're going to be retrogressive economically, and they're going to be retrogressive in more broad terms as well. You know? And I think that's why I find this current period so dangerous. It isn't a repetition of the 30s, but it's doing some pretty damaging things to international order and to what, you know, the things which should support international order, such as democracy, rule of law, progressive social legislation, and all the rest. Yeah.
How far would you regard nationalism to be some kind of like product of kings in the post-Reformation period to kind of mobilise the masses?
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, I mean, I've tried to write about it. I'm never pretending that I'm a great expert, all the experts, because nationalism is such a complicated phenomenon, and I've tried to write about this again in the piece I've done for Ken. I think Carl would say, look, you've simply got to look at nationalism
not as a thing, but what nationalism does. And if it contributes, as he would see it, to progress, and he's a great believer in progress. He does believe there is progress in history, which of course runs against pessimists and realists, actually, in many ways, doesn't it? This is why I've always thought it weird that Carr's been called a realist. Because realists, I think, are fundamentally pessimistic, in essence. He's a progressive, he is a progressive, but he also understands you've got to put the historical form of the nation in its own context and in its own time, and the functions that it performs in its own times. In his way of thinking about history, which is very normative, by the way, it is quite normative, he does think there are certain times and moments in times when the nation state and nationalism can perform what he would call relatively progressive functions, particularly if it's about the conglomerate. Let's say a country is not a country, it's composed of, let's say, 20,000 regions. And you kind of get a notion that bringing this all together in a single nation may be a good thing. And Rousseau's conception, I think, basically of the notion of nation and nationhood, the rights of man, bringing it together, I think he would kind of say, well, that is a progressive conception. That is leading forward. That is leading forward. Nationalism as such is not the problem always. It is the forms that nationalism starts taking after the First World War, particularly, and the consequences of this nationalism, this outbreak, this ethnic nationalism. One of the great writers on nationalism, Hans Kohn, wrote a wonderful book just after the war, 1944, and he made this real decision. He said, we've got to rescue nationalism, the notion of nationalism. I'm not quite sure I'll go on this with me. We've got to rescue nationalism from the ethno-nationalists. We've got to still see that at a certain moment in history, the notion of the nation and the notion of the rights of man, or rights of people, can be pulled together and perform, rather more progressive. He said, look at the French Revolution. I mean, the birth of modern nationalism, not going back to the medieval period, which I've been on very thin ice over there, sure. The birth of modern nationalism, Carr argues, begins with the French Revolution, and its first great theorist is Rousseau. Now, I don't think anybody, in the right mind would kind of think Rousseau is kind of retrogressive. Or the French Revolution itself did not, whatever one says about French power, it contained within it, some very deep liberal principles about emancipation and everything else. And I think that's the kind of nationalism Carr could live with, but that, he thinks, is the historical nationalism which has fast disappeared by the beginning of the 20th century. And of course collapses completely into what Hans Kohn then calls in his wonderful book, this ethno-nationalism, this kind of regressive nationalism, which identifies everybody else as the enemy, and the foreigner as the enemy, and the minority as the enemy. By the way, I made the point about Carr and small nations. Whether he had strong view, he kind of did think that small nations didn't have much of a future, that's to be sure. But also, I go back to what Carr did on the Minorities Treaty. Carr was insistent, as indeed were the great powers. It's always very easy to criticise the great powers, but it was the great powers in 1919 which are trying to impose on the small new states some degree of liberalism, some degree of rules which they have to follow. And I think later my old friend and comrade Fred Halliday said, you don't want to keep conceding too much to nationalists, because they don't always say the best things in the world, don't always do the best things in the world. And I think that what the great powers are doing, obviously for great power reasons, is kind of, look, we've got a problem. The problem is going to be minorities. We don't get this minority situation sorted out now, we're going to down the line have a huge security crisis on our hands, as indeed happened in the 1930s. And I think in that regard, on small nations, I think Carr was very keen to see the minorities within, language minorities, group minorities, religious minorities, and he wasn't religious himself, be protected. I think the work that he did on the minorities, I found some of the best work he actually did, because it went back to the heart of saying that self-determination alone is not going to solve your problems. It could exacerbate them deeply, and what the great powers have to do as responsibles, and that's the interesting question as well, as responsibles is impose some kind of liberal order on those who sometimes want nationalism but don't want the liberalism and the democracy and the tolerance that should accompany that.
Do you think that there's any promise in the nationalism today in kind of working through its own logic to kind of discard the particular, or come to a more universal concept or come to kind of a more universalizing project. You mentioned Chinese nationalism.
Yeah.
Which I think it's a really theoretically interesting kind of nationalism.
No, well, it is. But if I might put it blunt, it's still nationalism. I'll be specific on this. Once upon a time in my life, I thought there was, progressive nationalism, which was the nationalism of the oppressed, kind of third world nationalism, and then there was the nationalism of the oppressor. That's to say, the Western colonial capitalist imperialist country. That's my old Marxist days. That's what I used to kind of argue. Maybe in some ways I still think that's true, but I think that's just too damned easy, really. I think in a way. And on China, we could go into enormous amount of detail. China was oppressed in the 19th century. The century of humiliation, etc., etc. British is the biggest drug pushers in the world on the opium wars. Imposing. We can go through all the slights done to China over the centuries by the West, and you can include Britain as part of that. But nationalism in China today is, I think, not just a response to what the West did. It's also a way of legitimizing a very Stalinist party in China. It's also a way of being anti-Japanese, and it's also a way of legitimizing an increasingly assertive Chinese foreign policy, directed, by the way, at other small nations in Southeast Asia, and other nations in Southeast Asia, which are not so small, like Vietnam and the Philippines. So I find this increasing nationalism in China, which has never quite gone away, even in the Maoist period, I find this nationalism highly problematic. And I think we just have to call it by what it is. This is a great power rising. I don't think there's a Chinese exceptionalism, and I don't think Chinese nationalism has any more justification for being nationalist than anybody else does. And the consequences of its nationalism, I think, are going to be deeply disturbing, and are becoming increasingly disturbing in its own region. Because it is essentially imitating what other great powers have done in the past. I just don't see there's a Chinese way to going to the top. John Mearsheimer, a person I actually admire enormously, by the way, he likes really putting it out there, and I think it's just great. Not that I agree with him on everything. But I think, John Mearsheimer made the point very well. Well, what does China do? They're just imitating us, the United States. They're simply doing what the United States did in the 19th century. They've got a Monroe Doctrine. Less the South China Seas. They don't like minority groups within their own country. Well, guess what they do? Whether it's Tibetan or and I think we've got to really not be we've got to be a bit more truthful and honest about what's happening in China, not be like I said, held down either by some guilt about the past, which we should be guilty about, or indeed because China is somehow going to be different. I worry enormously, and what I think is even more worrying is you're getting a kind of an increasing nationalism in the statements of President Xi Jinping on a whole bunch of things, whether it's economics or whether it's other countries or Southeast Asia or whether it's anything else. I've lived in China on and off for 12 years, so I've kind of picked quite a lot of stuff. It's got worse over the last, in my view, it's got much more difficult, much more aggressive, much more assertive over the last few years than when I first went there, when Hu Jintao was the president. And if you get that, and then on the other side of the Pacific, guess what you've got? You've got Trump. And you can't believe that Trumpism, whatever you want to call it, is simply living in its own isolated world. One feeds off the other. One will feed off the other. And that's a very dangerous security dilemma, because you've written about, Ken, over the years. That's a very dangerous security dilemma. I don't think we're completely in it, but I think we're pretty damn close to getting into that. And one thing will then feed off the other, and an American nationalism and sense of grievance against China, if you can imagine it, but they do on trade, will then feed another sense of grievance in China against, It may well be in the end that they're going to pull back from the brink. Maybe the logic of economics and nuclear weapons and international institutions and allies will make a difference this time around. We certainly hope so.
Yeah.
So the small nation's nationalism is annoying, and the disdain for it is well aimed on Carr's side, I think. And partly we see it because they have nothing else than the small nationalism. But is there anything that leads Carr to believe that actually the big units, and it was interesting, you spoke about large units, and so does he, that makes them actually immune? In other words, do we not see their nationalism just because they have a lot more things going on, but they are actually as distasteful in their nationalisms as the small ones? The small ones are just peculiar and have nothing else really going on.
Point taken. I mean, I suppose the one working example we've had of something institutionally which has, in a sense, tried to transcend what I call the logic of the nationalist discourse, which has not tried to replace it with a new form of nationalism of its own, which I think, like the Soviet Union, I think maybe you're thinking of anything like that, China or whatever. I suppose the one working example I can think in my mind now is actually what happened in Western Europe after World War II. I think there was, a genuine recognition, both certainly by France and definitely by Germany, that the kind of narratives and policies and what had happened in the interwar period was disastrous for order, disastrous for Germany, disastrous for France, and then that I think is why it does stand out as the one living example we've still got. That's why I hope, like most people, I'm so deeply upset about Brexit, because it's not just about the peculiarities and the narratives of the Conservative Party, which no longer seems to be, like my father would say, proper Tories, ruling class. They don't do it any longer. Crazies, right? The mad people take over the house. It is that the European Union was a project, and that project was post-nationalist. It was post-nationalist. It didn't obliterate a national sovereignty completely. Maybe it should have done it. Maybe it's impossible. But it did get as close. I think you play that, Ken. It did get as close as we got to that. Without idealising everything about what has happened. It did act as a damper. It did act as a limit. But what we're also seeing today, as many of you have asked in your questions, is a reaction to this. We're back, in part, to the old-fashioned identity politics, taking back control, and that taking back control can only lead to one thing. That will lead to more ethno-nationalism, and the enemy will become, as the great Toynbee said, the enemy will become the outsider, the enemy will become the immigrant, the enemy will become the refugee. And if we can't think beyond that, then we're in deep trouble. We're in very deep trouble. When he said, "Forget the distance between insiders and outsiders," I think that's such a moving phrase. Forget the distance between insiders and outsiders. A bit like Nick on his book on Saving Strangers. It's a very powerful moral call. In some part, I do think that is what we have to aim for. And the only thing I can think of as an institution which got even halfway there, was the European Union. And the other thing I find still extraordinarily optimistic about the future, not much optimistic about the UK. I know I'm in Wales, so I won't say the nation. But the one thing I do feel quite optimistic about is the younger people who grew up within Europe, take, it seems to me, a much more cosmopolitan. I don't want to oversell it, but I do think that is noticeable. Right across Europe is younger people who feel more European, who feel much more at home in Europe, who kind of want to be anywhere and not just somewhere, to use David Goodhart's term. These are the people who kind of feel quite at home in traveling. Now again, that is very much, of course, within a group of people who are more educated, more mobile. I know the sociology of this. That does, seems to me, be a beacon of some hope moving forward. Yeah.
We've time for one more.
Yeah, on that last point, so following up on Henry, so what if, so as we know, and it's only in part, but present day nationalism is a response also to the fact that these larger political and economic units have become technocratic, elitist, and non-democratic, and indeed have followed economic ideologies, which basically have led to austerity in a way in which actually the nationalism of the European Union, for many who were saying no, is Germany. What about that whole side? Because I'm sure you have lots of thoughts about it. But it's the other side that we need to think about as we're thinking about your normative orientation forward from where we are.
Yeah. I think, I agree. I mean, I only posed a few questions here, and I couldn't pretend to give you all the answers. I try my best this evening. In a way, I think this is a profound crisis. You know the arguments about national populism, I'm sure, Richard, you know. Is it about globalization? Is it about inequality? Is it about austerity? It is a function of the post-2008 crisis. You know, all the kinds of things, job mobility, immigration, does it undercut wages, etc., etc., etc. And also there's the cultural identity argument. You know, it's all about identity. I've lost my community. Who am I? Where am I? That's the kind of question that, remember Sam Huntington, he wrote that book some years ago, you know, where am I? What is it? What is America any longer? And he kind of, you know, got very, very kind of about the question of Spanicization of America. Many people. So there's all those sorts of questions bubbling along on the surface. You know, of course there are. And I wish I could have an easy answer. But the only thing I suppose I would say is the following. This nationalist populism has to be understood, but it doesn't have to be accepted. You know what I mean? I found that some of the identity literature in the 1990s actually didn't have enough normative distance between itself and the phenomenon it was studying. I felt that anyway, that was my own take on it. Maybe my friend Fred Halliday told me, don't believe what these ethnic nationalists are saying about themselves. You know, you've got to understand the phenomenon, but you don't have to accept it. You can stand outside of it, understand, but at the same time critique it. That's a general kind of reflection, really an answer. But clearly, what is happening, and I think it's pretty clear. John Eisenberg, who's a very wonderful guy in many ways, but he's the most depressed human being I've met for a long time. We know why John is so depressed, because in a sense, the liberal project, which he's been theorising so brilliantly and so cleverly for many, many years, that liberal project is in deep trouble. And that liberal project has been associated with all sorts of cosmopolitan ideas. We've identified it with globalisation, a certain kind of globalisation, by the way. Globalisation didn't have to take the form it did, this kind of neoliberal form that it took.
So for E.H. Cox,
yes.
Is the normative orientation still federalism?
Well, if it produces the backlash that it does, then sometimes you simply got to take a position and advocate certain kinds of policies which you think are the right policies. I think you can do no more than that, Richard. It's a bit like this debate about Mrs. May and this current deal. I think it's the worst deal possible. I wouldn't accept it in a million years because I think it's a disaster. So you could take a compromising position. So, well, let's go along with it, because it's the best we've got anyway. If we don't take it, we're going to crash out the EU, and we're all going to be eating grass in about 2 weeks' time. You know what I mean? I mean, exaggerated. I think at a certain point, Richard, you do just have to sort of, like Martin Luther. I'm not a Lutheran. So here I stand. This is my position. This is what I think is correct. This is what I think is right. And damn to the consequences. And damn if I'm the one voice in the room saying it. Well, then I'll have to be the one voice in the room.
Right. If you wish to continue this discussion, there's a seminar tomorrow morning, 10:30 till 12 in this room, when some of us will be talking to Mick about his wider work, but also wanting to probe a little bit further what he's been saying about nations and nationalism. I want to finish by thanking a few people. First of all, as Mick has kindly said a few times, he has an article coming out in the Journal International Relations early next year. The Journal International Relations basically sponsors the Carr Lecture annually, and we in turn are sponsored by the publishers Sage, who also sponsor this particular lecture. So I want to record my thanks to Sage. I also want to thank the DDMI interns who have helped with the publicity, the poster, the vidcasting, various other jobs, including putting out the chairs earlier during our minutes of chaos. So thank you very much. I don't know how we in the journal would manage without you on occasions like this. And I also want to thank their leader, Jan Brzezinska, who is the director of the DMI, without whom they wouldn't exist and wouldn't be as well organised. So, thank you.
Lots of personality.
I mentioned earlier that Mick has this framed copy of David Davis's impressive remarks setting up this department. It's a pure coincidence that Mick happens to be here in exactly the week 100 years ago when the news of the setting up of the Wilson chair went out into the public via the Western Mail, the Manchester Guardian, the Times and other newspapers. So by a great coincidence, you happen to be exactly a year after it all began. And as a small memento of this, I want to give you
photograph this
exquisite piece of pottery.
I should smile, shouldn't I? Oh, I'll take the rabbit. Is there any gin? Any gin?
So hold it up.
I'll hold it up. Should we hold it together? Thank you. Make sure that doesn't go viral. Destroy any credibility I've got left, which isn't very much.
Thank you very much for entertaining and informing us so much over the last hour or so, and we look forward to more entertainment and information tomorrow.
All right, yes. You're going to for the price of one.
Yes.
Oh, you're not paying me anyway. What am I doing?
For the price of nothing.
For the price of nothing.
Can I ask your family to put your hands together and thank me?